While you're grinding away in WoW Classic, downing Molten Core for the 20th time with no loot to show for it, and your sights set on hoping next isn't as nearly as disappointing, you're probably constantly thinking about the future. What could be with this whole Classic thing? The inevitable release of Classic TBC. Yes, the Burning Crusade will eventually come to retail, so you can actually pay for the privilege of getting camped while waiting for the Ring of Blood to open up. But in waiting for the Dark Portal to crash the server yet again, there's a lot to think about because the Burning Crusade and Vanilla WoW really were two totally separate experiences. So I've decided to make a series of videos highlighting the differences between Vanilla and TBC as we prepare for real this time to take on Illidan and his brouhaha. Today's topic is only seldom thought about but often stressed by min-maxy tryhards, and that's the concept of racial traits and races in general. Most players won't think twice about their racials when creating their character and will just play whatever they think is cool. Ignorant fools! Don't they know that this is classic WoW? There's no place for personal enjoyment when you're downing raids. The Burning Crusade is no different, and in fact, racials could prove even more useful now than in Vanilla. So let's run down how racials have changed from WoW Classic to the future of Classic TBC, and we'll go into just how popular each race and class combination was in the original TBC to predict what would be the most popular in a Classic TBC server scenario. TBC saw some major distinctive changes to racials that coincided with game mechanics and stats that were adjusted with the expansion. One example of this would be the human racials of mace and sword specialization. In Vanilla, they provided with an increase to sword and mace skill by 5. However, in TBC, they got a buff to increase your expertise with those weapons by 5 instead. Why is that a buff? Weapon skills from Vanilla still exist in TBC. You still have to whack level 10 birds whenever you get a new weapon you've never used before, just so that you can hit things close to your level later. You need to train your weapon skills. Mace and sword specialization in humans was meant to help in that, essentially saying that you don't have to hit level 10 birds, you can go straight to level 15. This, maybe to someone, provided some benefit, but in the long run your skill would be maxed out and it would be irrelevant. In TBC though, the change to increase your expertise rating with those weapons, well now that's something pretty decent. Expertise was a brand new stat introduced in TBC. It was similar to your hit stat in that it helped your character do damage to a target, but rather than reducing your chance to miss, it reduced your target's chance to dodge or parry. For spellcasters, expertise also increased your spell hit rating by the same amount, so you don't feel left out. So yeah, much better than getting your skill up a little higher, this was certainly a buff. Another human racial to be buffed was the human spirit, growing from a 5% increase to spirit to 10%. Not nearly as exciting, but hey, a buff's a buff. While that to some may seem like a small change in the vocabulary of a racial, it's actually more important than you think. However, orcs saw a much more substantial change. If you're running an orc now in Classic WoW, this change from Classic to TBC will really excite you. First, some bad news though, especially for you PvPers out there. Hardiness gets a nerf, reducing the stun resist from 25% to 15%. I guess ignoring 1/4 of the stuns on you just made Horde too OP, so it gets gimped. Like humans, orcs see a similar stat change to their axe specialization, going from a skill increase of 5 to, again, 5 expertise with both 1- and 2-handed axes. Like mentioned before, this is good, thumbs up. Their biggest change, however, came to the activated racial ability, Blood Fury. In Vanilla, it increased your base melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds, but also reduced all healing done to you by 50%. Note that. Melee attack power. So warlocks, hunters, shamans who weren't enhancement, i.e. all shamans, they never used this racial. It was almost a strict detriment. In Classic TBC though, it will now grant you appropriate stats based on your class, so it actually becomes useful. For hunters, warriors, and rogues, it will now increase your attack power by a flat amount. Warlocks have their damage and healing spells increased also by a flat amount. And shamans get the best of both worlds, covering both enhancement and its much better counterparts by increasing their attack power and their spell damage and healing at the same time. Though strictly better than in Vanilla, it still comes with the healing debuff. Dwarves and trolls didn't see nearly as significant changes to their racials as humans and orcs did, although they do buck a pattern we saw with the weapon specializations in TBC. Logic would suggest that the dwarves' gun specialization and the trolls' bow and throwing weapon specialization would see a change from vanilla's straight 5 skill increase to 5 expertise. However, since one cannot dodge a bullet or arrow, or a throwing axe apparently, expertise would be worthless on these racials. So rather than increase expertise, they increase the crit chance with these weapons by 1% instead. This is another straight buff, especially for a DPS class. Funnily enough, I probably would prefer the 5 skill and throwing weapons though. I'm not going to toss axes at squirrels to get that skill up, I'm just not. Other than that, dwarves and trolls stayed relatively the same. Trolls saw a minor buff to their berserking racial, going from in vanilla increasing attack and spell cast speed from 10 to 25% based on your missing health, to now increasing it from 10 to 30%. So you had a slightly higher top end if your health really tanked, still a buff, just a real minor one. So dwarves and trolls saw minor changes, but these races saw no changes whatsoever. Night elves, tauren, gnomes, and forsaken all made the jump from vanilla to TBC with no significant alter to their racial abilities. So even when classic TBC is eventually released, you won't have to worry about maxing out the benefits of these racials. That is, unless you went gnome warrior, then well, you don't have as an expansive of a mind as you thought. Yet still even greater than these changes, or even lack of changes, classic TBC's greatest addition to the discussion of races and racials would certainly be the inclusion of 2 completely new races. Yes, Blood Elves and Draenei may seem like old school races by modern WoW measures, but going from classic to classic TBC, they certainly shook things up a lot. They took the idea of racial bonuses being something very personal to the individual player and turned them into something much more, giving them more complexity and usefulness in raids and parties, thus expanding the role racials play in the game itself. Blood Elves and Draenei racials could quite literally make or break someone's playstyle. First, let's run down the Horde's Blood Elves, the faction's first non-monstrous race created in an attempt to expand Horde appeal outside of Hot Topic shoppers. Their racials included Arcane Affinity, an increase to your enchanting skill by 10, and Magic Resistance, which upped all of your resistances by 5. But the real cookie here was the fact that they're the first race to have 2 activated racial abilities, Mana Tap and Arcane Torrent. Many older players know exactly what these racials would do in classic TBC, but for more modern players, these racials have been changed and even dropped like 100 times, and are essentially unrecognizable, playing completely differently from what we see today. In TBC, Mana Tap is an instant ability that reduces the target's mana by 50 and gives you a charge of arcane energy. It can stack up to 3 times and lasts 10 minutes. In conjunction, Arcane Torrent is an instant ability that silences all enemies within 8 yards for 2 seconds. You gain either 10 mana or 10 energy for rogues for each mana tap charge currently affecting you. These racial abilities were meant to be weaved together to provide you with a bigger benefit, making you think about the ideal sequence and timing of this racial. It became a more complex addition to your rotation when compared to other racials. Still, the benefit actually really paid off for the extra work you put in. Over the course of 1.5 minutes, you can drain 150 mana, silence enemies, and gain either 30 mana or 30 energy. That mana may seem inconsequential, but 30 energy is an extra kick or shiv for a rogue. Needless to say, if you're more of a PvP fan in these classic servers, Blood Elf would be a pretty good pick. Classic TBC sees some contention between which Horde racials perform better in PvP, with the debate trending towards either Forsaken or Blood Elves. The Forsaken's extra trinket is certainly nice, but the mana drain and instant silence of the Blood Elves could be even stronger in some situations. It's no wonder the Horde were just superior in PvP. Draenei on the Alliance side also changed how we saw racials in TBC. While the Blood Elves racials were more prominent in the player's rotation with added complexity, the Draenei's racials could literally shift the way other players geared their characters and would define raid comps for the entire expansion. Of course, they get their classic set of less impactful racials, things like gem cutting, an increase of 5 to your jewel crafting skill. Nice because it's the new profession of classic TBC, but not really impactful to gameplay. More substantial was Gift of the Naru, an activated heal overtime ability that healed 50 damage over 15 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. This is great for anyone playing a class that utilizes the spell power stat, so your mages, priests, and holy paladins. That's because the heal is improved based on your spell power and nothing else. Later on, it would scale with attack power too, or even just heal for a flat percentage of the target's health, making it more usable for warriors and hunters. But those changes don't come until at least Wrath of the Lich King. For classic TBC, it's basically an added heal for priests and holy paladins. The real game-changing racial, however, for a classic TBC server comes with the Draenei's Inspiring or Heroic Presence. This was a party-wide buff that increased either attack or spell hit chance by 1%. Unlike later iterations, where hit chance for spells and melee attacks were sort of melded into one single stat, in classic TBC, the Draenei racial actually changed depending on what class you played. If you were a paladin, hunter, or warrior, you get Heroic Presence, which increases attack hit by 1%. Mage, priests, and shamans get Inspiring Presence, which does the same thing but for spell hit chance. So what? It doesn't sound like much, right? A 1% chance to hit. Who cares? Hit chance in a classic TB server is a massive stat, probably one of the most important stats in the game. For raids, it does everything from ensuring tanks can generate threats to maximizing DPS output. Hit in TBC has a soft cap everyone outside of healers needed to reach to ensure they didn't miss their targets, especially raid bosses with their abilities. Having both an attack power and spell power Draenei in your raid meant that you didn't need to strictly hit that cap. They gave you some wiggle room. This means that the stress to get hit capped was less for the Alliance side, and gearing was more situational. One could drop a heavy hit piece of gear sooner in favor of more damage pieces if they knew a Draenei was coming to a raid. This is where we see guilds building up teams with the Draenei hit racial bonus in mind, maxing out damage potential knowing that at least some of their hit would come from a warrior or mage Draenei specifically invited to the group. It really changed the way the player base saw racials, and for a classic TBC server, at least on the Alliance side anyway, be prepared for guilds to target Draenei specifically, simply for their presence. Oh, and heroism. Now for some fun wayback statistics for the end of original TBC near the start of Wrath of the Lich King. So it's not a perfect representation of how races were chosen around TBC's time, but this is roughly around the same build as we would see on a classic TBC server, so it should prove to be relatively accurate to gauge players' interests in those races. The most popular race among players in total would be the Forsaken, so the Undead. Undead topped the charts at 19.1% of the player base. Following in close second would be their more fleshy counterparts, humans, holding at 18.1% of the player base. Coming in a surprisingly close third, the Blood Elves, with that useful arcane torrent racial in PvP, edging out 17.6% of the player base. From there on, things start to trend downwards. We have Orcs at 11.7%, Torrent at 10.5%, Night Elves at 7.2%, Draenei doing better than some of their classic alternatives at 6%, Trolls at 4.5%, Gnomes coming in short at 2.9%, and finally hitting the bottom of the barrel with Dwarves, making up only 2.4%. And just so that I'm fully transparent here, these stats are coming from a more PvP leaning source, so this is from players who actively PvP'd. Still, it shows us just which races seem to be the most popular in original TBC and how they could possibly be mimicked in a classic TBC server. Getting even more specific, let's look at the top races for each class, as racials are tied significantly to what role you're performing. For priests, the overwhelming majority were undead at 40.2%, and then humans at a distant second at 20.4%. Druids, I mean, come on, you only had two choices, but still, Tauren eked out better than Night Elves, likely because the player base tended to lean towards the Horde anyway, and this was a near 60-40 split. Warriors saw a more staggered split, with Orcs taking the top spot at 35.4%. Paladins, sort of controversial here, with Blood Elves taking the big lead in TBC with 59.8% of Paladin players. This likely had to do with the differences between Horde and Alliance Paladins, namely that the Horde got the Seal of Blood ability, which in TBC just offered more DPS, essentially making Red Paladins viable but only for the Horde. With orcs having not only a buff to their attack power, but also an increase of pet damage, it's no shock they too claim the top spot for hunters with 32.5% of the population. Undeads again hit the top, this time for another clothy class, claiming 49.7% of all mages. They continue showing their cloth dominance with warlocks, winning the hat trick at 45.8% of the warlock population. Now, coming out of left field, Draenei take the top spot for shamans at 34.8%. This, upon further inspection, isn't really a surprise, as their hit ratio is pretty useful in raids, as well as being the Alliance's only source of a bloodlust effect. And the undead prove they can wear more than just cloth, with taking 38.8% of rogues. And that's why people memed them so hard in Classic and TBC, they're just pretty much everywhere. While it's not clear exactly how Blizzard will implement a Classic TBC server, whether we'll start new characters or carry our vanilla ones over, it is clear that Classic TBC will change a lot from what we see in Classic. Races and racials are no exception. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and got some use out of it. It's always fun seeing how people back in TBC selected their race when making a character with racials and their class in mind. I'll be doing more of these pre-classic TBC videos later on, so if you have a topic you want discussed, let me know in the comment section below. And until next time guys, see ya!